The letter said he'd be waiting. It promised a home, a husband, a life worth living. But when she stepped off that train into a Montana blizzard, the man who wrote those letters was 3 weeks dead. And the brother who found her freezing on that platform had no idea that saving her life that night would be the thing that finally saved his own. Now let me tell you how it all began. She stepped off the train into nothing. No husband waiting on the platform. No warm smile, no outstretched hand, no promise kept. Just snow. Snow falling sideways in sheets so thick the world beyond 10 feet disappeared into white fury. The wind did not blow. It attacked. It came screaming across the open plains of Montana territory like something wounded and vengeful, tearing at her thin navy dress, clawing through her threadbare gloves, biting into every inch of exposed skin until the pain became a presence of its own, a living thing wrapped around her bones. The sign on the platform read Silver Creek, though half the letters were buried under drifts. The station itself was barely a station at all. A wooden platform, a single bench, a narrow overhang that provided perhaps 2 feet of shelter from the weather, which was to say no shelter at all. The railroad was new to this part of Montana, and the station reflected that rawness. Unfinished. Bare. A place built for function, not comfort, in a land that offered neither easily. Eliza Harper sat on that bench, clutching her wooden trunk with fingers she could no longer feel, and waited for a man who would never come. She was 23 years old, and she was freezing to death. The dress she wore had been elegant once. Navy blue fitted bodice, modest neckline, showing the delicate line of her collarbones. Long sleeves with small, lace details at collar and cuffs. It was the finest thing she owned. In Philadelphia, it had drawn admiring glances. Here in the teeth of a Montana blizzard, it was as useful as tissue paper. The fabric, once crisp and well-pressed, was now damp with melted snow and stiff with ice where the moisture had refrozen. Her gloves, thin kid leather she had saved 3 months of factory wages to buy, did nothing against the cold. Her fingers had passed through pain, through numbness, into something beyond numbness. A terrifying absence of all sensation as though her hands had simply ceased to exist. At her throat, a small cameo brooch pressed against her skin like a coin of ice. It was her mother's, the only thing of value she owned in the world. She had sold everything else. The furniture, the books, even her father's pocket watch, which had broken her heart more than anything. But the brooch she kept. It was the last piece of the woman who had loved her, and Eliza would sooner freeze with it against her skin than survive without it. Beside her sat the trunk. It contained the entirety of her earthly possessions. 2 dresses, both mended so many times the original stitching was a memory. Undergarments. A Bible her father had inscribed on her 16th birthday, the ink now faded to brown. For my Eliza, who reads the world as carefully as she reads these pages. Love, Papa. A sewing kit. A pressed wildflower from her mother's funeral, its petals thin as whispered prayers. And 7 letters from a man named Ethan Calloway. These letters were the reason she was here. They had arrived over 6 months, each one carefully written in a hand that was steady and warm. He described his ranch in the mountains of Montana, the valley where elk grazed in the early morning mist, the spring that never froze bubbling up from some deep place in the earth like a gift. The way the sunrise painted the peaks gold, and how he wished someone were there to see it with him. He described a life that was hard, but honest, isolated but free. And in between the descriptions of land and weather and livestock, he had woven something else. Kindness, a gentleness of spirit that came through in every carefully chosen word. He was not a poet. He did not write with flourish. But he wrote with sincerity, and to a woman who had known nothing but hardship and deception for years, sincerity was worth more than poetry. His advertisement in the matrimonial paper had been simple. Rancher in Montana Territory seeks wife. Hard life but fair man. Must be willing to work. Must not be afraid of winter. Eliza had not been afraid of winter then. She had been afraid of Reginald Pemberton. She had been afraid of his wet smile and his wandering hands and the way he leaned too close when no one was watching. She had been afraid of his father's power over the factory where she stitched 16 hours a day until her fingers bled. She had been afraid of the debts her dying father had been tricked into signing, debts that somehow became chains binding her to the Pemberton family. She had been afraid of the life closing in around her like the walls of a coffin tighter every day, darker every night until answering a stranger's advertisement in a newspaper felt less like desperation and more like the last rational act of a woman running out of options. She had answered. Ethan had written back. And over 7 letters, a future had taken shape. Not a grand future, not a romantic fantasy, but a real one. A place where she could stand on solid ground and breathe air that did not smell of factory smoke and fear. Now she sat on a frozen bench in Silver Creek, Montana territory, and that future was gone. The train conductor had warned her before departing. He was a weary man with kind eyes and a mustache that drooped with the weight of too many winters on the rail. "Ma'am, if nobody comes for you, there's nothing out here. The next train is 3 days away." She had smiled and assured him that someone would come. Her intended was a reliable man. He had promised. The conductor had looked at her the way people look at stray animals, with pity and with the quiet relief that the problem was not his. That had been 4 hours ago. 4 hours of watching the snow erase the tracks. 4 hours of listening to the wind howl. 4 hours of feeling the cold work its way deeper and deeper past skin, past muscle, into the marrow of her bones, into the core of her hope. She had stamped her feet until she could no longer feel them. She had tucked her hands under her arms until even that warmth failed. She had pulled her collar higher, drawn her knees to her chest, made herself as small as possible against the vastness of the storm. And now she had stopped shivering. She knew what that meant. She had read about it in one of her father's medical texts years ago, when he was still alive and their house was still full of books and warmth and the smell of his pipe tobacco. Before the consumption took his lungs, before the coughing started, before the blood. Hypothermia, the book called it. The body's surrender. First the shivering stops, then drowsiness comes heavy and sweet, then warmth, strangely, impossibly, a false warmth that wraps around you like a blanket just before the end, then sleep, then nothing. She had stopped shivering. She should be terrified. Instead, she felt a strange, exhausted calm. Perhaps this was not the worst way to go. She thought of her mother who had died in a bed that smelled of lavender and laudanum, her eyes already somewhere else. She thought of her father who had coughed his life away in a room full of books. He could no longer read, his brilliant mind trapped in a failing body. She thought of the factory in Philadelphia, the endless rows of sewing machines, the needles that pricked her fingers until they were permanently scarred, the owner's son with his entitled smile and his assumption that everything in the building, including the women, belonged to him. She closed her eyes. Somewhere beyond the white curtain of snow, a man was riding home from checking his fence line on the South Ridge, the last chore of a day that had started before dawn and would end long after dark. He had not planned to pass the station. The storm had pushed him east, and the horse, wiser than its rider in matters of navigation, had followed the rail line as a guide through the blinding white. And then she heard hooves. The sound was almost lost in the storm, a rhythmic thudding muffled by snow growing steadily louder. Eliza's eyes opened. Through the swirling white, a shape materialized. A horse first, enormous, dark as ink against the snow, steam billowing from its nostrils in great plumes. And on the horse, a man. He was massive. Even through the blur of snow and gathering darknesses, his size was unmistakable. He sat the horse with the ease of someone born in the saddle, his body moving with the animal rather than merely atop it. As he drew closer, details emerged from the white. A wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind, a heavy coat dusted with snow shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the entire horizon. He rode slowly, deliberately, scanning the platform with eyes that caught the last traces of daylight like a predator's. The horse stopped at the platform's edge. For a moment, the man simply looked at her. She could not see his face clearly beneath the hat and the upturned collar, but she could see his eyes. Amber. Intense, the eyes of a man who missed nothing and gave away less. "You shouldn't be out here." His voice was deep, rough from the cold or perhaps rough by nature, but not unkind. It was the voice of a man who did not waste words, who measured each one before releasing it the way a carpenter measures wood before cutting. Eliza tried to respond, but her lips were stiff, her jaw locked with cold. The words came out broken, barely audible above the wind. "I was waiting for someone." The man's eyes narrowed. He scanned the platform again. The empty bench, the snow-covered tracks, the single trunk, no other soul in sight. "Who ta?" "Ethan." The name felt like a prayer on her frozen lips. Ethan Calloway. He wrote to me. He said he would be here. Something changed in the man's face. The hard lines around his mouth deepened. His eyes, already intense, became something else entirely. Something guarded and raw, like a wound that had never properly healed, being pressed upon without warning. He was silent for a long moment. The wind screamed between them. Ethan's dead. 2 words, flat, controlled. But beneath the control, something alive and agonized like an animal caught in a trap. Eliza stared at him. The cold, the exhaustion, the 4 hours of waiting had left her mind slow, her processing sluggish. The words reached her ears but could not find purchase in her understanding. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. What? 3 weeks ago, he's gone. A pause so heavy it seemed to bend the air. I'm his brother, Wyatt. The world tilted. Not physically, though later she would not have sworn to that. It was an internal tilting, a fundamental shift in the architecture of her reality, as though someone had removed the floor and left her standing on nothing. The man she had traveled 1,500 miles to meet. The man whose letters she had read and reread until the paper softened and the ink smudged from her fingerprints. The man who had offered her the only future she had left. He was dead. 3 weeks dead. Buried in Montana soil. She had never walked on, mourned by brothers she had never met, gone from a world she had crossed a continent to share with him. She had no money, no connections, no way home. The future she had so carefully, so desperately constructed from 7 letters in a train ticket had collapsed in a single sentence spoken by a stranger on a frozen platform. She did something she had not done since her mother's funeral. She broke, not dramatically. Eliza Harper was not a woman who shattered loudly. She had learned through years of loss and labor, and the particular cruelty of watching everything she loved die slowly, that falling apart was a luxury she could not afford. So she broke quietly. She simply went still, and tears formed in her eyes and froze on her cheeks before they could fall, tiny crystals of grief catching the last light. Wyatt Calloway watched this from the saddle of his horse. He was not a man equipped for tears. He had spent 3 years avoiding his own grief, burying it beneath work and silence, and the relentless demands of a ranch that required every ounce of his strength to sustain. He had no idea how to handle someone else's sorrow, but he recognized the look on her face. He had seen it in his own mirror the morning after Sarah died. The look of someone who has just realized they have nowhere left to go. No direction, no shelter, no reason to take the next step except the terrible biological imperative to keep breathing. He dismounted. His boots hit the platform with a heavy thud that she felt through the frozen wood. Up close, he was even larger than he had appeared on horseback. 6 feet 5 inches of sun-weathered muscle and frontier hardship towering over her by more than a foot. His frame broad enough to block the wind. For a moment, standing before her, he was a wall between her and the storm. The snow swirled around his shoulders as though respecting his space. "Can you ride?" he asked. She blinked. "Where? My ranch, 4 miles. He glanced at the sky, reading the weather with the instinct of a man who had spent his entire life under open skies. "This storm is going to get worse. We don't leave now, we don't leave." Eliza looked at this stranger, this enormous granite-faced stranger who had just told her that the life she had planned was impossible and was now offering her the only alternative to death. She made a decision. Not from trust, not from hope, from the most basic human instinct there was. Survival. "Yes," she said, "I can ride." Wyatt lifted her trunk onto the back of his horse as though it weighed nothing. Then he offered her his hand. It was enormous, calloused, scarred across the knuckles from years of work she could not imagine. She placed her small, frozen hand in his massive grip, and the contrast was stark enough to tell a story all by itself. Delicate and powerful, Philadelphia and Montana. Everything she had been and everything she was about to become captured in the meeting of 2 hands. He lifted her onto the horse with a strength that was almost startling, effortless, as though she were made of paper, rather than bone and grief and frozen clothing. Then he mounted behind her, his body a furnace of warmth at her back. "Hold on," he said, and they rode. The 4 miles to the Calloway Ranch were 4 miles of pure survival. The blizzard had become a living thing, a roaring white beast that tried to tear them from the saddle with every gust. The horse plowed through drifts that reached its chest, each step a battle against snow that seemed determined to swallow them whole. Wyatt rode with absolute focus, one arm around Eliza to keep her in the saddle, the other on the reins, guiding the horse through a landscape that had been erased by the storm. There were no landmarks, no fences, no roads. Just white in every direction, and a man who knew this land well enough to navigate it blind. Eliza pressed back against him. Not by choice, by instinct. His body radiated heat through their coats, a furnace in the frozen world, and her body sought it the way a drowning person seeks air. She could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her shoulder blade. Slow, measured, unafraid. Whatever this man was, whatever pain he carried, fear was not among his qualities. They did not speak. The wind would have stolen their words anyway. When the ranch finally appeared, it seemed to materialize from the storm like a vision conjured by a fevered mind. A main house, 2 stories, solidly built, with the squat resilience of frontier construction. Warm yellow light glowing in the downstairs windows like earthbound stars. A large barn dark and solid against the snow. Several outbuildings half buried in drifts, leaning at angles that suggested years of hard winters and not enough hands to repair them. Fences had become abstract suggestions beneath the snow, their posts jutting up like the bones of something long dead. But the house, the light, in that moment they were the most beautiful things Eliza had ever seen. Wyatt brought the horse to the barn first, dismounting with practiced ease and helping Eliza down. Her legs buckled when she hit the ground. They had gone past numb into something else, something that felt like they belonged to a different body entirely. She stumbled, and Wyatt caught her with one arm around her waist, steadying her against him as though she were made of glass. "Inside," he said. "Now." They pushed through the snow to the front door. He kicked it open, and warmth rolled out like a wave breaking on a shore. Eliza stumbled into the house, and for a long moment, all she could do was stand there, dripping melted snow onto the wooden floor, letting the heat wrap around her frozen body like an embrace she had forgotten she needed. The main room of the Calloway house was large, masculine, and Spartan. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a healthy fire crackling within it, the flames casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn furniture. A table scarred by years of use, chairs sturdy and unadorned, a bench against one wall. The walls were bare except for a few hooks holding coats and hats, and a single framed photograph above the mantel that Eliza could not yet make out. The house smelled of wood smoke, leather coffee, and something else. Something harder to name. The smell of a place where life had been endured rather than enjoyed. A place where comfort was an afterthought, where warmth was functional rather than emotional. A man was sitting at the table when they entered. He was younger than Wyatt, but built from the same mold. Tall, broad-shouldered, with chestnut brown hair that fell across his forehead in a way that was almost boyish, contradicting the hard line of his jaw and the tension in his shoulders. His eyes were amber like his brother's, but lighter, closer to gold, and they carried a restless energy that Wyatt's did not. Where Wyatt was granite, this man was gunpowder. Where Wyatt was still, this man vibrated with something barely contained. He stood when he saw Eliza, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, with a sound that cut through the crackle of the fire. "Wyatt, what the—" His golden eyes moved from his brother to the woman, taking in her ice-crusted dress, her blue-tinged lips, her enormous cornflower blue eyes wide with exhaustion and grief, and the particular disorientation of a person whose world has just ended. "Who is she?" Wyatt closed the door against the howling wind. The sudden absence of the storm's roar made the silence feel enormous. "She's Ethan's." The word hung in the air between them. 2 syllables loaded with everything. Loss, accusation, memory, the name of a dead man spoken in a house that still echoed with his absence. Jesse Calloway stared. His face cycled through emotions with the speed of a man who wore his heart on his sleeve despite every effort to hide it. Confusion first, then recognition, then something darker, something that looked like pain and anger tangled so tightly they could not be separated. "The bride," he said. It was not a question. His voice was flat, hard, the voice of a man building a wall with every word. She was at the station. Alone. 4 hours in this. Wyatt was already moving, pulling a blanket from the back of a chair, filling a kettle from the water pump in the kitchen. His movements were efficient, purposeful. A man who handled crisis by doing rather than feeling. She had nowhere to go. Jesse's jaw tightened until the muscle jumped beneath the skin. He looked at Eliza again, and this time there was no curiosity in his gaze, only resistance. Ethan's dead. She can't stay here. She'll freeze if she doesn't. That's not our problem, Wyatt. Jesse. Wyatt's voice dropped to a register that was not loud but was absolutely final. It was the voice of a man who had been making decisions for this family since he was 22 years old, who had buried a father and a wife and a brother and had not once wavered in the face of what needed to be done. It was the voice that ended arguments not by winning them, but by making clear that the argument was over. Enough. Jesse held his brother's gaze for a long moment. Something passed between them. Something old, rooted in years of hierarchy and love and resentment and the complicated architecture of brotherhood. Then Jesse grabbed his coat from a hook by the door, yanked it on with a violence that spoke volumes, and walked out into the blizzard without another word. The door slammed behind him. Eliza stood in the middle of the room, dripping melted snow onto the wooden floor, trembling. Not just from the cold now, from exhaustion, from grief, from the overwhelming awareness that she was an intruder in a dead man's house, surrounded by his brother's pain, wearing a dress meant for a wedding that would never happen. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know about Ethan. I didn't know." Wyatt paused in his work. He turned to look at her, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, that she would remember for the rest of her life, his iron control slipped. She saw what lived behind those amber eyes. Grief so deep it had its own geography. Guilt that had calcified into something he carried in his chest like a stone. And loneliness. A loneliness so profound, it seemed to have rewritten the very architecture of his face, pulling the lines deeper, hardening the jaw, hollowing something behind the eyes that had once perhaps been capable of softness. Then the mask returned. Click, like a lock turning. "Drink this." He handed her a cup of hot coffee. "Get warm. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." He showed her to a small room upstairs, Ethan's room. The bed was neatly made with a quilt that had been washed so many times its pattern was fading. A few books sat on a shelf. A writing desk stood by the window, and on it a stack of paper, a pen, and an inkwell, the instruments of the letters that had brought her here. Vein stains of ink marked the wood surface. Fingerprints. Ethan's fingerprints. She placed her own finger on one of the marks, feeling the rough grain of the desk beneath her skin. This was the closest she would ever come to touching the man who had called her across a continent. On the wall, a small framed photograph. 3 men standing before this very house. Wyatt in the center, shoulders already broad, though he looked to be in his mid-20s. To his right, a younger man with an open, warm smile. Ethan. She studied his face with an ache that surprised her. Kind eyes, a gentleness in the set of his mouth. The face of a man who would write letters to a stranger with sincerity rather than poetry, because sincerity was all he had and all he thought was worth giving. To the left, a teenager trying to stand tall, chin lifted with the bravado of youth. Jesse. 3 brothers. Now 2. Eliza sat on the bed. She pulled the 7 letters from her trunk, their paper softened by months of reading, the ink smudged by her fingerprints, the way Ethan's ink had stained his desk. She held them against her chest and cried. Silently, the way she had learned. Because in her life, grief had always been a private thing, performed in small rooms behind closed doors in the hours when no one was watching. She cried for Ethan, whom she had never met but somehow already loved. She cried for herself, for the future that had dissolved like snow in warm hands. She cried for the life she had left behind and the life she had come to find, both of them gone now, both of them unreachable. When the tears stopped, she lay in the dark and listened to the blizzard howl against the walls of a stranger's house and wondered what morning would bring. Morning brought cold clarity. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world buried in white so complete it hurt to look at. The sky was a blue so intense it seemed painted, and the sun, when it appeared over the eastern ridge, turned every surface into a field of diamonds. Beautiful. Brutal. A landscape that would kill you while you admired it. Eliza washed her face with water from a basin that had a thin skin of ice on top. She pinned her hair as neatly as she could, straightened her dress, and descended the stairs with the composure of a woman who had learned that falling apart was a luxury reserved for people with choices. Wyatt was at the table drinking coffee. He looked as though he had not slept. The lines around his eyes were deeper than the night before, and his jaw carried the shadow of a night spent doing something other than resting. Worrying, perhaps, or simply sitting in the dark the way men like him did, processing the world through silence rather than speech. Jesse was nowhere to be seen. "Morning," Wyatt said, nothing more. "Good morning." Eliza stood at the foot of the stairs uncertain. She did not know the rules of this house, this family, this world. Everything she had known, the factory, the city, the letters, the plan, had been obliterated. She was operating without a map. Wyatt studied her for a moment, then he said, "There's bread and coffee. Sit." She sat. They ate in silence. The quiet was not hostile. Wyatt was simply a man who existed comfortably without words, who had long ago discovered that silence was not emptiness but a different kind of communication. Eliza, who had grown up in a noisy factory and a crowded city, found it strange and against all expectation calming. Finally, Wyatt spoke. He set down his coffee cup with the careful precision of a man about to say something he had rehearsed. "I need to be honest with you, Miss Harper. Ethan wrote those letters without telling us. We didn't know about the arrangement until after he died, when we found the drafts in his desk." He paused. "We don't have the money to send you back to Philadelphia. The train ticket costs more than we can spare right now. This winter has been—" He trailed off, but the sentence finished itself in the tightness of his jaw. "How long until you could afford it?" "Months, maybe spring, if the cattle survive." And until then, his jaw worked. He was clearly uncomfortable. This was a man who built fences and broke horses and fought blizzards. Negotiating domestic arrangements with a woman he had met 12 hours ago was outside his area of competence, and he knew it. "You can stay here. There's room. You'd have Ethan's room." He hesitated, then added with a formality that seemed to cost him something. "This is not— I'm not suggesting anything improper. You'd have your own space, your own privacy. My brother and I sleep downstairs. You'd be safe here." Eliza considered this with the pragmatic clarity of a woman who had been making survival calculations since she was 18. She had no alternatives, no money, no connections, no way home. And even if she could return to Philadelphia, what awaited her there? The factory, Pemberton, the debts, the walls closing in. "I won't be a burden," she said quietly. "I can work. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend animals. I earned my keep in Philadelphia, and I'll earn it here." Wyatt looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time since the train platform, he seemed to see not just a problem to be solved, but a person. He saw the determination beneath the delicate features, the steel wrapped in silk, and something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly. Wyatt Calloway's face was not built for softening, but it adjusted the way granite adjusts when water finds a new path through it. "All right," he said, "until spring." Those 3 words would prove to be a promise neither of them knew how to keep. The first days at the Calloway Ranch were defined by 3 things: awkwardness, tension, and the relentless brutality of a Montana winter that seemed personally invested in their destruction. Eliza learned quickly that running a ranch in January was not a job. It was a war. The cold was an enemy that never slept, never retreated, never showed the slightest mercy. Every morning brought new battles. Frozen water troughs that had to be broken with an axe, the ice shattering in thick chunks, while your arms ached and your breath turned to clouds. Snow-collapsed fences that had to be dug out and repaired with numb fingers. Cattle that had to be fed in check for frostbite, their eyes dull with the misery of an animal that understood only that the world was trying to kill it. Wood that had to be chopped and stacked and burned in quantities that seemed impossible, but an endless cycle of labor that consumed the morning before the sun had fully risen. Wyatt worked from before dawn until after dark. He was a machine, tireless, efficient, solitary. He chopped wood with a heavy axe, each stroke precise as surgery, the oak splitting along its grain with a sharp crack that echoed across the frozen landscape. He chopped for 2 hours every morning before sunrise, the woodpile growing waist-high, squared and stacked with the obsessive neatness of a man who controlled what he could because so much was beyond control. His breath made columns of white in the frozen air. Sweat froze on his forehead before it could fall. He did not ask for help. He did not complain. He simply worked as though the physical labor was the only thing keeping something inside him from breaking. Jesse drifted in and out like weather. He slept late, worked in bursts of furious energy that burned out as quickly as they flared and disappeared to town whenever the trails were passable. He barely acknowledged Eliza's presence. When he did speak to her, his words were clipped, his tone carefully neutral. He was not cruel. He was simply refusing to let her in. Every time he looked at her, she could see it in his golden eyes. He was not seeing Eliza Harper from Philadelphia. He was seeing the life his dead brother had wanted and would never have. Eliza observed, adapted, and began with the quiet determination that had kept her alive through factory floors and predatory employers, in the slow death of everyone she loved, to carve out a place for herself. On her second morning, she rose before Wyatt. This required waking at 4:30 in the morning in a room so cold her breath crystallized in the air above her bed. She dressed in the dark, splashed ice water on her face, pinned her hair, and descended the stairs to find the kitchen cold and empty. By the time Wyatt came downstairs at 5, the fire was lit, the coffee was hot, and the kitchen smelled like something other than dust and survival. He stopped in the doorway, surprised. For Wyatt Calloway, surprised meant a slight widening of the eyes and a pause that lasted perhaps 2 seconds longer than normal. She said nothing. He said nothing. He drank the coffee. It was the beginning of a ritual that would outlast the winter. On her third day, Eliza discovered that the kitchen, a large room at the back of the house equipped with a magnificent cast-iron stove, had been essentially abandoned. The brothers ate beans from a can, jerky, bread that had the texture and taste of building materials. The stove, capable of producing meals that would make a frontier hotel envious, it had been used for little more than boiling water. Eliza rolled up her sleeves. She inventoried what supplies existed. Flour, salt, lard, dried beans, a few root vegetables in the cellar that had survived the cold by virtue of being underground. Not much, but enough for a woman who had spent years stretching a week's wages into a month's meals. She kneaded dough on the wooden table, her hands pushing and folding in the rhythm her mother had taught her. Butter was scarce precious, so she used only a spoonful for the whole batch of biscuits, but it was enough to create a golden crust that filled the kitchen with a smell the house had not known in years. That evening, when Wyatt and Jesse sat down to dinner, the table was set. There were plates instead of tin cups, cloth napkins improvised from a piece of fabric she had found in a trunk. The stew steamed fragrant with root vegetables and the last of the dried herbs she had discovered in a forgotten jar. The biscuits sat golden and warm on a plate. Jesse stared at the meal as though it might be some kind of trap. Wyatt ate in silence, but he ate everything on his plate, and without being asked, he took a second helping. That night, as Eliza cleaned the dishes, she heard Wyatt's voice from the other room, low and measured, "She can cook." Jesse's response was a grunt, but it was not entirely dismissive. On the fourth morning, Eliza ventured outside to assess the ranch. She wrapped herself in Ethan's old coat, too large for her, smelling of cedar, and something faintly masculine that she tried not to think about, and walked the property. What she saw confirmed what she had suspected from the account books she had found at Ethan's desk. The ranch was dying, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the slow grinding way that winter kills. Outbuildings leaned at dangerous angles, their foundations weakened by years of freeze and thaw cycles that no one had repaired. Fences sagged or were missing entirely. The cattle, 78 head, where there had once been 150, huddled in a snow-covered pasture, looking thin and listless. And the spring, Ethan's famous spring that never froze, bubbled up from a rocky outcrop behind the house. She knelt beside it and dipped her fingers in. Cold, but not frozen. A ribbon of clear water cutting through the white world, precious beyond measurement. But she also saw what the land could be. The valley sheltered by mountains on 3 sides. The soil dark and rich where the snow had melted. The bones of a working operation beneath the neglect and grief. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table and began making lists. What the ranch had, what it needed, what could be done now, what must wait. She calculated with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who had survived by organizing chaos. Wyatt found her still writing at midnight. He stood in the doorway watching her hunched over the table by candlelight and did not ask what she was doing. But the next morning, her lists were gone from the table. And when he went out to break the ice in the water trough, he took a different route, checking the fence posts she had flagged, examining the outbuilding she had marked as dangerous. He was without acknowledgement following her plan. The breakthrough with Jesse came on a Tuesday morning, and it came through a horse. Wyatt was out checking the fence line on the far side of the property. Eliza was in the barn attempting to feed the chickens, a task she had taken over despite having no prior experience with poultry when she heard Jesse talking. Not to her, to his horse. Easy, girl, easy. His voice was different, gentle, patient, almost tender. The hard-clipped tone he used with people was gone, replaced by something that sounded like the man he might have been in a different life, or perhaps the man he was when he thought no one was watching. I know it hurts. Let me see. Eliza peered around the stall partition. Jesse was kneeling beside his mare Bonnie, examining her front right hoof. The horse was limping, and Jesse's face, usually set in a mask of indifference or irritation, was soft with concern. Stone bruise, he muttered. Frozen ground. Can I help? Eliza asked. Jesse startled. For a moment the guard came back. Then, perhaps because he was worried about the horse, perhaps because he was tired of the silence that filled the spaces where Ethan's voice used to be, he nodded. Hold her head. Talk to her. She needs to stay calm while I work on this hoof. Eliza moved to Bonnie's head and began to stroke the mare's velvet nose, murmuring soft nonsense that animals seemed to find soothing. Bonnie, who was known to bite strangers, lowered her head and leaned into Eliza's touch with a sigh that steamed in the cold air. Jesse watched from his position at the hoof. She doesn't usually like people. Animals can tell when someone means them no harm. He worked in silence for a moment, cleaning the bruise with careful hands, packing it with a poultice that smelled of herbs. Then, without looking up, he said something that changed everything. Ethan would have liked you. Eliza's hand stilled on Bonnie's neck. It was the first time Jesse had mentioned his brother to her directly. Not as an accusation, not as a wall, as a bridge. He wrote that he was looking forward to showing me the ranch in spring, she said carefully. He said the wildflowers were beautiful. Jesse's throat worked. His golden eyes glistened, though he would have denied it. They are. He used to pick them for Ma when she was alive. Big handfuls all mixed up. Columbine, larkspur, Indian paintbrush. Ma would put them in a jar on the table. A pause that carried the weight of years. After she died, he'd still pick them, put them in her grave. He sounds like a good man. He was the best of us. Jesse's voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment the facade dropped entirely. He was not a reckless, angry young man. He was a grieving brother who had lost the person he loved most in the world, and the pain of it was so raw, so present, that it transformed his face into something almost unrecognizable. He was always the best of us, and he stopped, swallowed, returned to the hoof. Eliza did not push. She had learned that grief had its own schedule, and forcing it led nowhere good. But something had shifted between them. A door had opened, just a crack, just enough to let in light. That evening, Jesse joined them for dinner without being asked. He sat at the table, ate the stew, and when he was finished, he said without looking at Eliza, "Thank you for helping with Bonnie." Of course. It was not much, but in this house of silence and grief, it was everything. On the fifth VO, Eliza found the letter. She was cleaning Ethan's room, her room now reorganizing the books on the shelf, when a folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages and fell to the floor. She picked it up. It was addressed to her. The date was 2 days before Ethan died. The handwriting was his. She recognized it immediately, but different from his other letters. Rushed. The words pressed hard into the paper as though written in urgency. Dear Eliza, I must tell you something before you arrive. I have discovered something about our land that changes everything. I cannot write the details here, as I fear this letter may be read by unfriendly eyes. But know this, the ranch is in danger, and the man responsible will stop at nothing. I am going to ride out to the northern boundary tomorrow to gather proof. If something happens to me, find the survey marker at the old pine, the one split by lightning. The truth is buried there. Come quickly. I need you. Ethan. Eliza read the letter 3 times. Her hands trembled. Not from cold this time, from understanding. Ethan Calloway did not die in an accident. Ethan died because he discovered something dangerous enough to kill for. And whatever he found, whatever truth he buried at a survey marker she had never seen, It was still out there, waiting. She considered showing the letter to Wyatt immediately, but something stopped her. She barely knew these men. Trust she had learned through painful experience was a currency best spent carefully. She tucked the letter into the lining of her trunk and said nothing. But that night, lying in the dark, listening to the wind moan against the walls, she made a promise. To Ethan, whom she had never met. To herself, who had come too far to stop now. She would find the survey marker. She would discover what Ethan died for. And she would not let this ranch, this family, these brothers who had taken her in from the storm, be destroyed by whatever darkness had swallowed the man who had called her here. Eliza Harper had survived a factory, a predator, a 1,500-mile journey, and a blizzard that should have killed her. She was not done surviving yet. 2 weeks in the house began to change. Small things at first, a cloth on the table, dried wildflowers arranged in a jar found in the cellar where someone, perhaps Ethan's mother, years ago had stored them. The kitchen floor scrubbed until the wood grain showed through years of grime. Curtains improvised from blue fabric she found in a trunk hung in the kitchen window. The smell of bread baking instead of smoke and dust. Wyatt noticed these changes. He said nothing about them. But he began leaving his muddy boots on the porch instead of tracking them through the kitchen. For Wyatt Calloway, this was a concession of enormous significance. The afternoon Silas Hargrove rode up to the ranch changed the temperature of everything. The day was cold but clear, one of those deceptive Montana winter days, where the sun shone bright and the sky blazed an impossible blue, while the temperature remained well below zero. 3 riders approached from the east. The lead rider sat a black horse with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it to his advantage. Even at a distance, something about him set Eliza's nerves on edge. There was a deliberateness to his approach, a predatory patience that reminded her of Pemberton. A man who took what he wanted and smiled while doing it. Wyatt emerged from the barn. He did not hurry. He did not show concern. He simply stood, arms at his sides, and waited. Jesse appeared from the side of the house, positioning himself to Wyatt's right. The brothers stood together, a wall of muscle and resolve. Wyatt, the lead rider, tipped his hat, silver-streaked black hair beneath it, cold gray eyes that missed nothing, a smile that did not reach them. Cold day. Hargrove, what do you want? Same thing I've always want, son, to make you a fair offer for this land. The voice was smooth-cultured for a frontier man, the voice of a man who had learned that honey caught more than vinegar, though he kept the vinegar close at hand. I know times are hard. Winter's been brutal. I'm prepared to offer you more than the land is worth. Not interested. Think about it, Wyatt. You're running this place with 2 men. Ethan's gone. Winter's only going to get harder. Hargrove's gaze slid to Eliza, who had stopped hanging laundry and stood watching from the clothesline. His eyes moved over her with the slow appraisal of a man inventorying property. I see you have a guest. Our business, not yours. Hargrove's smile sharpened. It was the smile of a man who understood power the way a wolf understood territory. Everything in this valley is my business, son. That's just the way things are. He leaned forward in the saddle. I'm being neighborly now, offering cash for land. But winter makes men desperate, and desperate men make poor decisions. He turned his horse and rode away. His 2 men followed. One of them, a broad, scarred man Eliza would later learn was Hank Dawson, glanced back at her before they disappeared over the ridge. That evening, the tension in the house was thick enough to cut. He won't stop, Jesse said, breaking his self-imposed silence. He never stops. I know, Wyatt said. So what do? We hold. Wyatt's voice was granite. This is Calloway land. Pa built it. We keep it. Jesse's fist hit the table. The plates rattled. Pa built it, and it killed him. Ethan tried to keep it, and it killed him too. How long before it kills one of us? The silence that followed was devastating. Jesse seemed to realize what he had said and what he had implied a moment too late. His face drained of color. Go to bed, Jesse. Wyatt's voice was quiet, terrible in its quiet. Jesse stood. His chair crashed backward. He stalked upstairs without another word. The door slammed. Eliza sat across from Wyatt, a witness to the fracture running through this family. A crack deeper than any argument about land. She looked at his hands on the table and saw they were trembling. This man, who seemed carved from the same stone as the mountains around them, was shaking. "He's scared," Eliza said softly. "That's all." Wyatt looked at her, and for just a moment a heartbeat the mask slipped. She saw the exhaustion, the grief, the loneliness that had become a second skin. She saw a man who had been strong for so long he had forgotten there was anything else to be. A man holding a family and a ranch together with nothing but his bare hands and his refusal to surrender, and the cracks were showing, and he knew it, and the knowing was almost worse than the breaking. "We're all scared," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said to her, and in that moment something shifted between them. Not romance. It was far too early, and they were both too guarded for that. But recognition, the quiet, powerful recognition of one survivor seeing another. Two people who had lost everything and were still standing, held upright by nothing more than stubbornness and the dim, persistent, unquenchable belief that tomorrow might be different. Eliza lay awake that night. She thought about Ethan's letter hidden in the lining of her trunk, about Hargrove's cold gray eyes, about the survey marker at the old split pine that she had never seen, about what Ethan had discovered that was worth killing for. She thought about Wyatt's trembling hands and Jesse's golden eyes wet with grief he could not name. And she made a decision. This ranch was failing, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, steady way that winter kills. One frozen pipe, one dead calf, one broken fence at a time. Wyatt and Jesse could not do it alone. They needed help. They needed someone to remind them what they were fighting for. And Eliza Harper, who had survived everything the world had thrown at her and was still standing, was not going to watch another life she had built crumble without a fight. Tomorrow, she would begin. The first time Eliza Harper rode a horse alone, she fell off. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late January, 2 weeks after her arrival. Wyatt had been giving her riding lessons in the paddock behind the barn sessions that began out of practical necessity and continued because she showed a stubborn aptitude that surprised them both. The horse was Buck, an aging bay gelding with a temperament so steady he could have been carved from the same stone as the mountains. Buck did not spook at gunshots. Buck did not shy at snakes. Buck moved through the world with the philosophical calm of a creature who had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. But Buck had opinions about ice. The paddock had frozen overnight into a sheet of glass beneath a thin layer of snow. When Buck's front hoof hit the slick surface, he stopped dead, and Eliza, who had been practicing the trot, did not. She sailed over his neck and landed flat on her back in the snow, with a sound that was equal parts impact and indignity. She lay there for a moment staring at the sky. It was the blue of Ethan's ink, the blue of possibility, the blue of a world so vast it made her problems feel for exactly one breath small. Then she heard something she had never heard before. Wyatt Calloway was laughing, not loudly, not the way Jesse laughed, which was explosive and full-bodied and impossible to ignore. Wyatt's laugh was quiet, almost reluctant, as though it had escaped from somewhere deep inside him against his will. It was the sound of a man who had forgotten he was capable of laughter and was startled to discover it still lived in him, like finding a forgotten room in a house he thought he knew completely. Eliza propped herself up on her elbows and looked at him. He was standing by the fence, one boot up on the lower rail, his hat pushed back, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do. The hard lines around his mouth had softened. The permanent furrow between his brows had eased. For just a moment, for perhaps 3 seconds, Wyatt Calloway looked like a man instead of a monument. "Are you laughing at me?" she asked. The laugh stopped. The mask began to return, but not all the way. A trace of warmth remained around his eyes like embers after a fire. "You're supposed to stay on the horse." "Thank you, Wyatt. That's very helpful." He walked over and offered his hand. She took it. He pulled her up with the easy strength of a man who lifted hay bales and fence posts and everything else that needed lifting on a ranch where there was never enough hands. She was close to him for a moment, close enough to see the amber of his eyes in detail, the way they caught light like whiskey in a glass, and something passed between them that neither acknowledged and neither forgot. "Again?" he asked. "Again," she said. She got back on the horse. She did not fall off again. The riding lessons became part of the daily rhythm, along with the other skills Wyatt began teaching her without ever calling them lessons. He showed her how to split kindling standing behind her with his hands over hers on the axe handle, guiding the angle of the swing. The proximity was closer than either of them intended. She could feel his breath on her hair, warm in the frozen air, and the steadiness of his grip on the axe was the steadiness of a man who controlled his hands, because his hands were the only thing he trusted himself to control. He taught her to shoot. She had asked for this after Hargrove's visit, and Wyatt had agreed without argument, which told her everything about how seriously he took the threat. He set tin cans on the fence and stood beside her while she fired the small revolver. The first shot's recoil knocked her backward into his chest. He caught her with one hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "Lean into the shoulder," he said, his voice low and close to her ear. "Breathe in, hold it, squeeze." She found it difficult to concentrate on the tin cans, but the exchange was not one-sided, and this was what surprised them both. One evening after dinner, Eliza opened one of Ethan's books and began reading aloud. It was a habit from her childhood, something her father had done every night, his voice filling their small Philadelphia house with stories and ideas and the music of well-chosen words. She read without thinking, "The way you breathe," and it was several pages before she noticed the silence had changed. Wyatt was listening, not casually the way a man listens to background noise, but with the focused attention he gave to everything that mattered. And Jesse, who had been pretending to clean his boots by the fire, had stopped pretending. She looked up, met Wyatt's eyes. "You can read," he said. It was not a question. "My father was a school teacher. He taught me." A pause. Then, with a vulnerability that cost him more than any physical labor ever had, "We can't." She understood immediately. Ethan had been the reader in the family, the writer, the one their father had taught before the stampede took him. Wyatt and Jesse had been too young, and after their father died, there had been no one to finish the teaching and too much work to seek it out. "Would you like to learn?" she asked, gently, without a trace of judgment. Wyatt said nothing for a long time. Then he nodded. Once. The way a man nods when he is agreeing to something that frightens him more than blizzards or rattlesnakes or the silence of an empty house. The lessons began that night. Every evening after dinner, Eliza sat beside Wyatt at the kitchen table, her finger tracing the lines of text, her voice reading slowly while he repeated the words. His massive hands, built for splitting wood and breaking horses, looked strange holding a pencil. His first letters were enormous and crooked, wobbling across the page like drunken fences. But he persisted with the same grim determination he brought to everything, and within a week he could write his own name. Jesse pretended not to care. He sat farther from the table by the fire, seemingly absorbed in other things. But Eliza noticed his lips moving silently along with the words she read. And when she left Ethan's book open to the page they had covered face down on the table where Jesse would see it, she found it turned several pages further the next morning. Neither of them mentioned this. Some kindnesses are best performed in silence. It was in early March when the first suggestion of thaw softened the edges of the snow that Eliza rode into Silver Creek alone for the first time. The decision had been practical. The ranch needed supplies desperately. Feed was running low, tools needed repair, and the account book she had found in Ethan's desk told a story of debt that grew worse with each page. But supplies were not the real reason she went. She had another purpose, and it lived in the letter hidden in the lining of her trunk. She rode Buck along the main trail, the revolver in her coat pocket, the landscape spreading around her in every direction like a painting done by a god who favored white and blue. The ride took 2 hours. 2 hours of frozen creeks and stands of pine weighted with snow, and the vast, indifferent silence of a land that did not care whether she lived or died, but was beautiful enough to make the question seem almost beside the point. Silver Creek was a frontier town in the most literal sense. A single main street lined with wooden buildings and boardwalks slick with ice. A general store, a saloon, a church, a blacksmith, a small bank. And the particular smell of every frontier settlement she had ever imagined: horsewood smoke and the mineral sharpness of cold air. She tied Buck outside Whitfield's general store and went inside. The store was warm, cluttered, and smelled of tobacco, coffee, and dried herbs. It was the kind of place where you could buy everything from flour to ammunition to fabric, all stacked in cheerful disorder on shelves that reached the ceiling. Behind the counter stood a woman who looked like she had been carved from the same material as the mountains. Margaret Whitfield was broad-shouldered, steel-gray hair, pinned in a bun that could have survived a tornado, with eyes that could strip the bark off a tree at 50 paces. She was the kind of woman the frontier produced in small but significant numbers. Women who had buried husbands and raised children and run businesses and endured winters that would have broken lesser people, and who had emerged from all of it with a sense of humor as dry as the summer grass and a backbone made of iron. "Help you?" Maggie asked, eyeing Eliza with the frank curiosity that small-town residents reserve for strangers. "Eliza Harper. I'm staying at the Callaway Ranch." "Ah." Maggie's eyebrows rose. "You're the one." Word traveled fast in small towns carried by the same wind that carried the snow. "You're smaller than I expected." "I get that a lot." Something shifted in Maggie's face. The beginning of respect, perhaps. Or at least the recognition that this small woman from Philadelphia had a spine. Eliza purchased supplies, but as Maggie filled the order, she steered the conversation with the careful subtlety of a woman who had spent years navigating difficult social situations. She asked about the town, the winter, the neighboring ranches, and eventually with the precision of a surgeon approaching the critical incision about Silas Hargrove. The warmth in Maggie's face cooled like a stove going out. She glanced at the door, then back at Eliza. "You don't want to ask about Hargrove," she said quietly. "Not out loud, not in this town." "Why not?" "Because half the people in Silver Creek owe him money and the other half owe him favors. He owns the bank. He owns the deputy." She stopped herself, but the sentence finished itself in the tightness of her jaw. "He owns too much." Eliza leaned closer. "Mrs. Whitfield, I believe Ethan Calloway's death was not an accident." The color left Maggie's face like water draining from a basin. "And I believe Hargrove is connected to it. I have a letter from Ethan written 2 days before he died. He discovered something about the land, something dangerous." For a long moment, Maggie stood motionless behind her counter. Then she reached beneath it and pulled out a battered Bible. She opened it to a page in the middle and removed a folded piece of paper that had been pressed between the pages like a secret waiting to be told. "Ethan came to see me the day before he died." Maggie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He gave me this, told me if anything happened to him, I should give it to Wyatt. But Wyatt hasn't come to town since the funeral, and I've been too scared to ride out to the ranch." The paper was a map, hand-drawn with markings indicating boundaries, distances, and a spot labeled Survey Marker Old Pine. Beside it in Ethan's handwriting, 3 words that changed everything. "Silver deposits, Hargrove knows." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She folded the map carefully and tucked it inside her dress. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield." "Be careful, girl." Maggie's eyes were hard the way eyes get when they have seen too much and said too little. "Hargrove has killed before. He'll do it again." Eliza rode back to the ranch with supplies in her saddlebags and the truth in her dress and a growing sense of both purpose and dread. Ethan had not fallen from his horse. Ethan had been murdered because he discovered that the Callaway land sat on silver deposits worth a fortune, and Silas Hargrove wanted that fortune badly enough to kill for it. That evening, after Jesse had gone to bed, Eliza laid everything out on the kitchen table before Wyatt. The letter from Ethan, the map from Maggie, the suspicious entries in the account books marked H.O. Her theory assembled from fragments and intuition and the careful logic of a woman who had survived by seeing what others chose to ignore. Wyatt listened in absolute silence. His face was unreadable, a wall of granite revealing nothing. But his eyes told a different story. She watched the war inside him, fury battling grief, the desire for justice, fighting the instinct to protect what remained of his family. "I knew it wasn't an accident," he said at last. His voice was low, dangerous in its quietness the way a river is dangerous when it runs deep and still. "I knew his horse wasn't spooked. Ethan rode that trail 100 times. He knew every stone, every turn, every route." His hands flattened on the table, the scarred knuckles white with pressure. "But I couldn't prove it. And without proof, all I had was a dead brother in a valley full of people too afraid to talk." "Now we know where to find proof," Eliza said. "The survey marker at the old pine. That land is near the boundary with Hargrove's property. If I ride out there and his men see me, they'll know. They'll destroy whatever Ethan buried. Then we don't go yet. We go when we're ready. When we have allies." Her mind was already working, building strategy the way she had once built budgets, finding paths through impossible terrain. We need the town behind us. We need people willing to stand up. People are scared, Eliza. People are scared because they're alone. No one wants to be the first to stand up. But if we find a few, just a few, the rest will follow. Wyatt looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not gratitude, something closer to wonder. The bewildered recognition that this small, quiet woman from a factory in Philadelphia was in her own way as formidable as the mountains surrounding them. Ethan was right to send for you, he said. It was the closest thing to a compliment Wyatt Calloway had given anyone in 3 years. And Eliza felt it land in her chest like a spark finding dry tinder. Over the following weeks, Eliza built an alliance the way she built everything, quietly, deliberately, one person at a time. She started with Ruth McKinnon, the midwife, a stout, sharp-tongued widow who had delivered half the babies in Silver Creek and buried more than a few of their mothers. Ruth carried her own guilt about the Calloway family. She had been the midwife the night Sarah Calloway died in childbirth, the night when going to the doctor in Helena might have saved her, but the money in the distance said otherwise. That guilt was a debt, and Eliza helped her see a way to pay it. She visited Abel Foster, the oldest rancher in the valley. 62 years old, half-deaf and cantankerous in the way that only men who have spent 6 decades arguing with weather and livestock can be. But he remembered Emmett Calloway Wyatt's father with genuine affection. He remembered a time before Hargrove when the valley ran on mutual aid and handshake agreements. Used to be we looked out for each other, Abel grumbled, rocking on his porch despite the cold. Now everyone's scared of their own shadow. It doesn't have to be that way, Eliza said. Abel squinted at her. You're a pushy one, aren't you? I'm a determined one. Abel almost smiled. It looked like it hurt. Then I suppose I am too. At the Turner homestead, young Emily Turner, barely 20 with 2 children under 4, broke down crying when Eliza asked how she was doing. No one had asked in months. Emily told her about Hargrove's loan offer, the suspiciously generous terms, the fine print clause that would let him seize their land for any missed payment. He's not lending money, Emily whispered. He's setting traps. Tom Henderson, eldest of the 5 Henderson brothers who worked Hargrove's ranch as hired hands, was harder. He owed Hargrove his livelihood. But when Eliza mentioned Ethan's death, his weathered face hardened. Always thought that was wrong. Ethan was the best rider in the valley. Horses don't spook on trails they know. He would not commit, not yet, but he offered something almost as valuable. If the time comes and you need to know what goes on at his ranch, who visits in the night, what he orders, you come to me. Even Pastor Josiah Pruitt, a kind but ineffectual man who had spent years preaching caution when courage was needed, agreed to pray about it. Eliza considered this a start. Seeds did not become trees overnight. While Eliza built bridges in town, something was shifting at the ranch. Something quieter than alliances and more dangerous than silver. Wyatt Calloway was thawing. Not dramatically. Wyatt did nothing dramatically. The change came in increments so small they could have been imagined, except that Eliza was paying attention, and she did not imagine things. He began waiting for her to sit before he started eating. A small thing, a thing that might have meant nothing from another man. But from Wyatt, who had eaten standing up or walking or not at all for 3 years, it was a seismic shift. He asked her opinion on which pasture to move the cattle to. He listened when she answered. He did not agree with everything she said, but he listened, and for a man who had made every decision alone for years, listening was its own form of surrender. One morning she found a pair of leather gloves outside her bedroom door. Heavy, warm, clearly too large for her, but carefully rolled to fit smaller hands. Wyatt did not mention them. That afternoon she noticed him chopping wood barehanded. She found her kitchen chair repaired. The front leg had wobbled for weeks, not badly enough to complain about, but enough to notice. Someone had fixed it in the night, playing the wood smooth, even placed a thin piece of leather on the seat for comfort. No announcement, no acknowledgement. Just a chair that no longer wobbled and a man who said nothing about it. This was Wyatt's language. Not words, actions. Calloused hands speaking what his mouth could not. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sunset painted the mountains in colors that had no names in any language she knew, Wyatt said, "I haven't talked this much in 3 years." Eliza smiled. "Is that a complaint?" "No." He looked at her, and his amber eyes held something she had never seen in them. Warmth, True, unguarded warmth, like a door opening in a house she had thought was locked from the inside. It's the opposite. The moment stretched between them, delicate as spun glass and just as easily broken. She had learned to read the language of his silences, the working silence, tight and focused, the grieving silence, heavy and dark, the angry silence, rare but electric. And this silence, new and unfamiliar, soft at the edges, not the absence of words, but the presence of something words could not contain. She wanted to reach for his hand. She wanted to bridge the distance between them. But she knew him well enough to know he had to be the one to cross. He had to choose to feel again. She could not choose for him. I was thinking about expanding the south pasture when the ground thaws, he said, and she accepted the deflection with the grace of a woman who understood that Wyatt approached feelings the way he approached wild horses. Slowly, from the side, never head on. That's a good idea. The creek would give natural walled and access. He nodded and something in his face relaxed, grateful that she had not pressed, grateful that she spoke his language. But later, as she rose to go inside, he said her name. Just that. Eliza. And the way he said it with a softness that contradicted everything about his rough, weathered exterior told her more than any declaration could. Good night, Wyatt. Good night. She went inside. He stayed on the porch for another hour, watching stars appear one by one, and she knew because she watched from her window that he was having a conversation with someone who was not there. His face, usually so controlled, was open in the moonlight. Raw, aching, a man asking permission from a ghost for something he was not yet brave enough to name. She turned from the window and went to bed. Some griefs were private, she would not intrude. But the knowledge settled into her like warmth into frozen ground. He was not made of stone. He felt everything. He simply had no idea what to do with it. The fire came on a night in late March when the first hints of spring had just begun to show through the retreating snow. Eliza woke to the sound of screaming. Not human screaming, animal screaming. The cattle. A sound so primal and terrified it bypassed thought entirely and sent her body moving before her mind could catch up. She threw on clothes and ran downstairs. The main room was empty. Through the window, an orange glow. The barn was burning. She ran outside, and the scene that greeted her was chaos given form. Flames climbed the eastern wall of the barn, fed by the dry hay stored inside, climbing, with a hunger that was almost sentient. The cattle in the corral were panicking, throwing themselves against fences with a force that would break bones. Horses shrieked. Smoke billowed into the night sky like a black flag raised in surrender. Wyatt was already at the barn, hauling open the heavy doors with his bare hands to free the animals trapped inside. His silhouette against the flames was enormous. Primal, a man fighting the oldest enemy with nothing but his body and his refusal to let it win. Jesse was at the corral trying to calm the horses, but one of them caught him with a hoof, and he went down hard, his head striking a fence post with a sound that stopped Eliza's heart. She did not freeze. She did not scream. She ran to Jesse. He was dazed, bleeding from a cut above his eye, but conscious. She pulled him up, bracing his weight against her shoulder, a weight that should have been impossible for her frame but was somehow manageable because the alternative was unthinkable. Together they herded the panicked horses through the gate and into the open field away from the flames. Then she ran to the well and began filling buckets. Bucket after bucket, her arms burning her lungs, filling with smoke, the heat pressing against her face like a living hand. She ran between the well and the barn until her legs shook, until the buckets seemed to weigh as much as she did, until the world narrowed to three things: water, fire, and the silhouette of a man who would not stop fighting. It took 2 hours to put the fire out. By the end, the eastern wall of the barn was destroyed. 3 stalls were gone. The hay supply, already dangerously low, had been halved. 2 calves had not made it out. Wyatt stood in the smoking ruins. His face was black with soot. His hands were blistered, the skin raw and weeping. He was breathing hard each breath, a ragged sound that came from somewhere deeper than his lungs. His eyes, reflecting the dying embers, were the eyes of a man who had been pushed to the very edge and was looking down. Jesse limped over, holding a piece of fabric he had found near the base of the fire, a strip of red cloth, the kind used for bandanas. It smelled of kerosene. "They said it," Jesse said. His voice was shaking. Not with fear, with a rage so pure it was almost beautiful. Hargrove's men. They came in the night and they set our barn on fire. Wyatt took the cloth, examined it with hands that were burned and bleeding. His jaw was so tight, Eliza could see the muscles jumping beneath the soot-stained skin. "I'll kill him," Jesse whispered. "I swear to God, Wyatt, I'll ride to his ranch right now and I'll put a bullet in his head." "No," Wyatt's voice was eerily calm, the calm of deep water over sharp rocks. "That's what he wants. He wants us to ride over there angry and stupid so his men can shoot us and call it self-defense. We do this the right way." "What right way?" The deputy is in his pocket. "The law is in his pocket. There is no right way." "There is," Eliza said. Both brothers turned to look at her. She was standing in the ruined doorway of the barn, her nightgown covered in soot, her honey blonde hair loose and wild around her face, her skin smudged with smoke and sweat. She should have looked fragile. She did not. She looked like something that had been forged in the fire that had just tried to destroy them. Something that had gone into the flames as one thing and come out as another. "I've been building something," she said. "In town, people who will stand with us. Not many yet, but enough to start. And I have proof that Hargrove has been trying to steal this land because there are silver deposits beneath it. Silver worth a fortune. That's why he wanted to buy the ranch. That's why he killed Ethan. And that's why he set this fire." Wyatt and Jesse stared at her. "You've been doing what?" Wyatt said. Eliza lifted her chin. That particular gesture of quiet stubbornness that both brothers had come to recognize the tilt that meant she had made up her mind, and the discussion was purely informational. What needed to be done? The silence stretched, then Jesse, battered and bleeding and vibrating with fury, did something no one expected. He laughed. It was raw, broken, edged with pain, but it was genuine. The first real laugh she had heard from him since the night she arrived. "Ethan definitely would have liked you," he said. The weeks after the fire were filled with rebuilding. The barn rose from its ashes plank by plank, and it did not rise alone. Abel Foster arrived with lumber loaded on a wagon pulled by horses as old and stubborn as he was. The Turner family brought food. Ruth McKinnon came with bandages and her sharp tongue and an expertise in treating burns that spoke of a lifetime on the frontier. Even Pastor Pruitt showed up, and while he did more praying than hammering, his presence meant something. When the shepherd came, the flock would follow. But it was during this period of rebuilding that a different kind of destruction arrived, and it came wearing polished boots and a derby hat. The rider appeared on a clear April morning. Well-dressed for the frontier, clean coat, polished boots, a hat that looked absurdly out of place like a city ornament hung on a pine tree. He was pale, thin-lipped, and carried himself with the posture of a man who had never done a day of manual labor and considered this a point of pride rather than a deficiency. "I'm looking for Eliza Harper," the man said, dismounting. Eliza's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. She had heard it in her nightmares for 2 years. The voice of a man who believed that everything in the world could be owned, including people. "My name is Reginald Pemberton," the man announced, looking at Wyatt with the casual arrogance of someone addressing a servant. "I've come to collect my wife." Wyatt's entire body went rigid, every muscle locked. He looked at Eliza. She was white as the snow still lingering in the shadows of the mountains. "I am not your wife," she said. Her voice trembled but did not break. A tree bending in the wind but refusing to fall. Pemberton smiled. That smile. Wet. Proprietary. The smile of a man looking at something he had paid for and intended to collect. "I'm afraid the law disagrees, Eliza. Your father owed my family a considerable debt. Before his death, he signed a proxy marriage agreement in exchange for debt forgiveness. He produced a document, yellowed and official-looking, bearing signatures and a seal. It's all perfectly legal." "My father was dying," Eliza whispered. "He didn't know what he was signing. He couldn't even lift his own head." "The law doesn't make that distinction." Pemberton tucked the document away and let his eyes sweep the ranch with the bored assessment of a man evaluating property beneath his standards. "I've spent considerable effort tracking you down. You left Philadelphia without informing me. That was unkind." Wyatt stepping forward. He did not touch Pemberton. He did not need to. 6 feet 5 inches of sun-weathered muscle and barely restrained fury was statement enough. His shadow fell over Pemberton like a verdict. "You have 20 seconds to get off my land," Wyatt said. His voice was quiet. In Wyatt's case, quiet was far more dangerous than loud. Jesse appeared from the side of the house, arms crossed, every inch of his considerable frame radiating hostility. Two walls of muscle, two pairs of amber eyes blazing with protective fury. The Calloway brothers standing together the way mountains stand, immovable and ancient and not to be tested. Pemberton was arrogant, but he was not stupid. He looked from one brother to the other and took a step back. Very well, I'll return with a proper legal escort. But make no mistake, Eliza Harper is my wife under the law, and I will take her home. He rode away. The dust of his departure settled slowly. Eliza was shaking, not with cold, with rage and fear and the sickening realization that the past she thought she had escaped had followed her 1,500 miles across the continent, that there was no distance far enough, no mountain high enough, no blizzard fierce enough to outrun a man who believed he owned you. Is it true? Wyatt asked. His voice was gentle now, gentle in a way that cracked something open inside her, because gentleness from this man, this granite fortress of a man, was so rare and so unexpected that it hit harder than any blow. She told him everything. Her father's illness, the debts, Pemberton's pursuit, not violent at first, but relentless, the way water erodes stone slowly, patiently, with the absolute certainty that time was on its side. How he had blacklisted her from other employment, had her landlord raise the rent, made her life a shrinking box until the only opening left was the one he controlled. That's why I answered Ethan's advertisement, she said, and her voice was steady now, the trembling gone, replaced by the hard clarity of a woman who had stopped running. I wasn't looking for love, I was looking for escape. The silence that followed was heavy with everything unspoken. Jesse looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Eliza. And in his amber eyes something shifted, the final stone in his wall moving just slightly, revealing light behind it. You're not going anywhere, Wyatt said. Not with him, not ever. It was not a declaration of love. Wyatt was not yet capable of that. But it was a promise, spoken with the full weight of a man who did not make promises lightly and had never in his life broken one. That evening, after Jesse had gone to bed, Wyatt told Eliza she should leave. They were standing in the kitchen, the fire burning, low shadows moving on the walls like restless ghosts. Wyatt had been pacing a behavior so unusual for him that Eliza knew something significant was coming. Wyatt did not pace. Wyatt stood. Wyatt sat. Wyatt worked. Movement without purpose was as foreign to him as poetry. You should go, he said. Not with Pemberton, somewhere else, somewhere safe. I'll give you money, whatever we have. You can take the train west. California, Oregon, start over. Eliza stared at him. You want me to leave? I want you to be safe. His voice was rough, cracking at the edges, like ice in spring, breaking apart to reveal what had been trapped beneath. Hargrove is getting desperate. Pemberton isn't going to stop, and I can't. He stopped, turned away. His massive shoulders were rigid. His fists clenched at his sides, the burned skin stretching over his knuckles. I can't lose someone else, Eliza. I can't watch it happen again. And there it was, the truth he had been fighting since the night he found her on that frozen platform. Not anger, not indifference, terror. The bone-deep terror of a man who had buried a father and a wife and a child and a brother, who had become an expert at surviving loss, who had built his entire existence around the principle that the only way to avoid the pain of losing someone was to never let anyone close enough to lose. And she had gotten close. Without either of them intending it, without permission or planning, she had walked through his walls the way spring walks through winter. Not by force, but by persistence, by the slow accumulation of small moments, coffee and conversation, and a chair that no longer wobbled, and a laugh he had forgotten he was capable of. She crossed the kitchen, stood behind him. She barely reached his shoulder, but her presence filled the room, the way music fills a cathedral, not by volume, but by resonance. Wyatt. Her voice was soft, but it carried. Sarah's death was not your fault. He flinched. The first time she had ever seen his body react to words as though they were physical. Ethan's death was not your fault. You did not fail them by loving them. You honored them. He did not turn, but she saw his head lower, his shoulders bow, the great strength of him bending under a weight that was not physical and could not be set down. I have nowhere to go, she continued, but even if I did, Even if I had 100 places to go, 1,000, I would stay here. Not because of Ethan's letters, not because of obligation, not because I have no choice. She paused, drew a breath that was the bravest thing she had ever done. Because of you and Jesse and this land. This is my home now, Wyatt, and I am done running. He turned, his eyes were bright, not with tears because Wyatt Calloway would walk through fire before he let tears fall, and in fact he literally had, but with something close. The amber depths that had been hard and guarded and shuttered for 3 years were for this moment entirely open. Like a window thrown wide in a house that had been sealed shut. And what she saw through that window was not the granite man or the grieving brother or the tireless rancher. It was simply Wyatt, afraid and brave and lonely and hopeful and so full of feeling that it was a wonder the feeling had not torn him apart. I don't know how to do this, he whispered. I've forgotten how to let someone in. Then let me show you. She reached up and placed her hand against his cheek, her small, delicate hand against his rough, sun-weathered skin. The contrast was everything their story had been from the beginning, soft and hard, gentle and strong, everything she had been and everything he was. Two broken people standing in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and bread, finding the courage to be whole again. He covered her hand with his. His massive, calloused palm enveloped hers completely, and the warmth of his skin was a promise made without words, a promise that said, I am here. I am not leaving. I have been alone for so long that I forgot what warmth felt like, and now you are teaching me to remember. Stay, he said, not a command, a request. The first real request this proud, stubborn, magnificent man had made of anyone in years. Always, she answered, and in the low golden light of the kitchen, with the fire dying and the stars blazing beyond the windows, the distance between them closed. Gently, with the reverence of two people who understood that what was happening was not small or casual, but profound, the way rain is profound to a desert, the way sunrise is profound to someone who has survived the longest night. The door to the kitchen closed softly behind them. When morning came, everything between them had changed, not through grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but through the quiet, courageous surrender of two hearts that had finally, after years of running, found the place they wanted to stop. Outside, the last snow of winter was melting, and somewhere in the mountains, spring was waiting to be born. April came to the valley like a promise kept after a long silence. The snow did not leave all at once. It retreated in stages like an army withdrawing from a war. It had finally accepted it could not win. First, the south-facing slopes where the sun hit strongest, revealing patches of brown earth that steamed faintly in the morning light. Then the meadows where the snow thinned into a ragged patchwork of white and mud. Then the creeks which swelled with meltwater until they ran fast and clear over rocks that had been locked in ice for 5 months, making a sound like the earth itself was exhaling after holding its breath since November. The first wildflowers appeared on a Thursday. Eliza saw them from the kitchen window, small purple crocuses pushing through the mud near the fence line, and she stood there with a dish towel in her hands and tears she did not expect on her cheeks. She had survived the winter. They all had. And the land which had spent 5 months trying to kill them, was now offering beauty as casually as an apology. But beneath the surface of recovery, 3 threats remained coiled like rattlesnakes in tall grass. Silas Hargrove had been quiet since the barn fire. Too quiet. His men had not been seen near the Calloway property. No threatening visits, no riders on the ridge. This silence, Wyatt knew, was not retreat. It was preparation. Reginald Pemberton had taken a room at the boarding house in Silver Creek. He had been making inquiries, speaking with Deputy Virgil Crane, sending telegrams to lawyers in Helena. He moved through the town with the smug patience of a man who believed the law was a tool built for people like him, and he was right often enough that the belief had calcified into certainty. And Jesse Calloway was falling apart. The guilt he had carried since Ethan's death had been eating at him the way acid eats metal, slowly and visibly until the structure that looked solid was hollow and ready to collapse. The barn fire had cracked something in him. Pemberton's arrival had cracked it further. And now, with spring bringing the possibility of action instead of mere survival, the weight had become unbearable. He had started drinking again, disappearing to the saloon in town, returning late, unsteady, smelling of whiskey, in the particular kind of self-loathing that men carry when they believe they have committed a sin too large for forgiveness. Wyatt confronted him on a morning when the smell of whiskey was still on Jesse's breath, and his golden eyes were bloodshot, and his hands, those capable scarred hands, were trembling. "This has to stop." Jesse's jaw tightened. "Don't lecture me, Wyatt." "I'm not lecturing, I'm telling you." Wyatt stood in the kitchen doorway, filling it entirely, his amber eyes locked on his brother with an intensity that could have bent steel. "The ranch needs you. Eliza needs you." He paused. Then, with a vulnerability that changed the air in the room the way lightning changes air before a storm, "I need you." Those three words stopped Jesse cold. Wyatt did not say things like that. Wyatt did not admit to needing anything or anyone. He was the one who held, the one who carried, the one who stood when everyone else fell. The fact that he had said it now plainly and without armor told Jesse exactly how serious the situation was. "I killed him," Jesse whispered. The words came out like shards of glass, each one cutting his throat on the way out. "I killed Ethan." "No, you didn't." "I said terrible things to him, Wyatt. That last night, I told him he was a fool, that bringing a mail-order bride to this ranch was stupid and selfish, that he was playing house while the rest of us did the real work." His voice broke, and the sound of it breaking was the sound of something held too tight for too long finally giving way. "I was drunk and mean and jealous." He left upset. He rode out the next morning toward the boundary, and he never came back. Wyatt was silent for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. A log shifted in the stove. Outside, a meadowlark sang the first one of spring, its voice impossibly pure in the cool morning air. Then Wyatt crossed the room and did something he had not done since Jesse was 14 years old, and their father had just been carried home dead from a stampede. He put his hand on his brother's shoulder. Heavy, steady, the weight of it saying everything his voice could not. "Jesse, listen to me. Ethan didn't die because of what you said. Ethan died because Silas Hargrove had him killed. You didn't push him off that cliff. Hargrove's men did." His grip tightened. "And we are going to prove it." Jesse looked up. His golden eyes were wet. "How?" "The survey marker, the old pine, whatever Ethan buried there is the key. To the silver, to his murder, to all of it." Wyatt straightened, and in that straightening was the full measure of the man he was, the man who had held this family together through loss after loss, and would hold it together through this one too. "It's time." The expedition to the old split pine was planned with the precision of a military campaign. Eliza studied the map Ethan had left with Maggie Whitfield, identifying the location on the northern ridge of the Callaway property near the disputed boundary with Hargrove's land. The tree itself, a massive ponderosa split by lightning years ago, was a well-known landmark. What lay buried at its base was not. They went at dawn, all three of them. Wyatt on his stallion, Jesse on the heeled Bonnie, Eliza on Steady Buck. The morning was cool and damp, the sky overcast, the air carrying that particular spring scent that is equal parts mud and resurrection, and the faint sweetness of things beginning to grow. The ride took 2 hours. They followed trails that wound through stands of pine and aspen, still bare but budding across meadows, where the first wildflowers were appearing like scattered jewels along a creek swollen with snowmelt that roared with the energy of 5 months of frozen silence finally released. The landscape was vast and indifferent and magnificent. Eliza understood riding through it why men would kill for this land, not just for the silver beneath it, for the land itself, for the sheer breathtaking privilege of standing on this ground and calling it yours. They found the old pine easily. It was enormous, 6 feet in diameter, blackened on one side where lightning had struck years ago. The trunk split into 2 massive forks that reached toward the sky like arms raised in surrender or prayer. At its base, partially hidden by a cairn of rocks that could have been mistaken for natural accumulation if you did not know what you were looking for, they found a buried tin box. Jesse dug it out with his bare hands, the soft spring earth giving way easily. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture, were 3 items: a leather journal, a hand-drawn geological survey, and 3 letters. The journal was Ethan's. His handwriting filled every page with detailed notes spanning 6 months of investigation. He had found a piece of ore while checking the boundary line, and Curious had sent a sample to an assayer in Helena. The assayer's report tucked into the journal's pages confirmed significant silver deposits. Ethan had begun researching land claims mining rights in the legal framework surrounding mineral discoveries on private property. He had been thorough, methodical, the kind of careful, intelligent work that made Eliza ache for the man she would never meet, the man who had approached a mystery with a scholar's patience and a rancher's practicality. The geological survey was the critical document. It had been created by a geologist named Cornelius Whitmore, hired by Hargrove, to assess the region's mineral potential. But the survey contained a notation that Whitmore had likely not intended Hargrove to see, a note indicating that the silver deposits extended primarily under Callaway land, not Hargrove's. The wealth beneath their feet was theirs, and Hargrove knew it. The 3 letters were the most damning evidence of all. 2 were from Hargrove to Deputy Virgil Crane, written in a hand that was precise and cold and utterly without conscience. The first instructed Crane to ensure the Callaway matter is resolved quietly. The second, dated a week later, told him to file the accident report without further investigation and ensure no questions are raised. The third letter was from Crane to Hargrove, confirming that the matter has been handled as requested and that the coroner has been persuaded. No further inquiry will be conducted. Jesse read the letters. His face went white, then red, then something beyond color. Something that was not an expression but a condition, the face of a man watching the last doubt dissolve and being left with nothing but the bare, terrible truth. He confessed it, Jesse said. His voice was vibrating with a rage so pure it was almost calm. In writing, they killed Ethan, and they wrote it down like it was a business transaction. We take this to Helena, Wyatt said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the voice of a man who had been making the right decision under impossible pressure for 12 years and was not going to stop now. To the territorial marshal, this is evidence of murder, conspiracy, and fraud. Hargrove and Crane will answer for it, but only if we do it right. Wyatt is right, Eliza said. If we confront Hargrove directly, he destroys the evidence. He has the deputy. He might have the judge. We need to go above all of them to the territorial authorities where Hargrove has no reach. Jesse paced, volcanic energy barely contained. But he heard the logic. He was his brother's blood after all, and beneath the hot temper and the golden fury, the same vein of hard practical sense ran through him. Then we ride to Helena today. Not all of us, Wyatt said. Hargrove is watching. If the 3 of us disappear, he'll know something has changed. Eliza and I will go to Helena with the evidence. You stay. Watch the ranch. Keep things normal. And if Hargrove makes a move while you're gone, Wyatt met his brother's eyes, then you hold. You hold until we get back. Jesse straightened, his jaw set, and for the first time in months, the uncertainty left his face, replaced by something older and simpler and infinitely more powerful. Purpose. He had something to protect, something to fight for. And Jesse Callaway, whatever his flaws, had never in his life backed down from a fight that mattered. I'll hold, he said. Wyatt and Eliza rode to Helena. 2 days there, 1 day filing evidence and testimony with the territorial marshal's office 2 days back. 5 days during which Jesse stood guard over the Callaway ranch with a rifle on the porch and Bonnie saddled in the barn, and a focus so intense he did not take a single drink. When they returned, they brought news. The marshal had reviewed the evidence. Warrants had been issued. Men were coming. The law, the real law, was on its way. But Eliza had done more than file papers in Helena. She had also visited a territorial judge named Alden Crawford, a stern, principled man with no patience for legal manipulation. She had shown him Pemberton's proxy marriage document and explained the circumstances under which her dying father had signed it. Judge Crawford had examined the document, taken her testimony, and issued a preliminary ruling declaring the marriage void pending a formal hearing. His language, she was told, had been unusually direct. Coerced was one of the words he used. Unconscionable was another. Pemberton's legal claim was crumbling. The final confrontation came on a morning in mid-April that dawned clear and golden, the kind of morning that made you understand why people fought for this land, bled for it, died for it. The sky was the blue of deep water. The mountains stood sharp against it, their peaks still white with snow that would not melt until June. The valley spread below in every shade of green and gold, wildflowers beginning to bloom in the meadows, the creek running bright and musical in the distance. Hargrove rode up to the Callaway Ranch at 9 in the morning. He brought Hank Dawson 2 hired guns, Pemberton and Deputy Virgil Crane. They were armed with weapons and legal documents and the absolute certainty that comes from 20 years of getting everything you want. Hargrove expected to find a broken family, 2 brothers and a woman outnumbered and outgunned, ready to be crushed. Instead, he found an army. 12 ranchers stood with the Callaways. Abel Foster, 62 years old, his ancient rifle held in hands that were gnarled with arthritis but steady as stone. The Turner family. Sam and Emily, young and fierce, their jaws set with the determination of people who had almost lost everything and would not let it happen again. The 5 Henderson brothers, Tom at the front, who had worked Hargrove's land for years and knew every dirty secret it held and had decided at last that silence was its own form of murder. Maggie Whitfield, who had closed her store for the day and ridden out with a shotgun she handled with the ease of a woman who had used it before and was not afraid to use it again. Ruth McKinnon, who carried no weapon, but whose presence, the moral authority of a woman who had delivered their children and tended their sick and buried their dead, was worth more than any gun. And Pastor Josiah Pruitt. The pastor stood at the front of the assembled group, his Bible in one hand and a rolled document in the other. His face, usually soft with indecision, had hardened into something resolute. He had made his choice at 3 in the morning on his knees in his empty church. The answer came not as a voice, but as a certainty. The certainty that silence in the face of evil was itself a kind of evil. Beside Wyatt, close enough to touch his arm, stood Eliza. She wore a clean dress, her honey blonde hair pinned neatly, the cameo brooch at her throat. She looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had traveled 1,500 miles, survived a blizzard, rebuilt a ranch, outwitted a predator, and united a valley. 5 feet 3 inches tall. Magnificent. Hargrove pulled his horse to a stop. His cold gray eyes swept the assembled crowd, and for the first time in 20 years, Silas Hargrove was caught off guard. The mask of smooth confidence cracked. He had expected 2 men and a woman. He had found a wall of humanity, ranchers who had cowered before him for years, women who had whispered about him behind closed doors, men who had shaken his hand while despising the feel of it, all of them standing together looking at him without fear. It was the absence of fear that shook him most. Fear had been his currency, his weapon, his most reliable tool for 2 decades. Without it, he was just a man on a horse. "What is this?" His voice was still controlled, but there was a tightness in it, a crack in the foundation that had not been there before. Wyatt stepped forward. He was not carrying a weapon. He did not need one. "It's over, Hargrove. I have legal claims on. Your papers are worthless." Pastor Pruitt stepped forward, unrolling the document he carried. His voice, so often gentle and uncertain, rang across the morning air with a clarity that surprised everyone, including himself. "This morning I received a telegram from the Territorial Marshal's office in Helena. Based on evidence submitted by Wyatt Callaway and Eliza Harper, warrants have been issued for the arrest of Silas Hargrove on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and theft of mineral rights." Silence. Enormous. It filled the valley like a held breath, like the moment between lightning and thunder. Hargrove's face changed. The smooth mask did not just crack. It shattered. Beneath it was something ugly, cornered, dangerous, the face of a man who had spent 20 years building an empire on intimidation and deception and was watching it all come apart in a single morning. He looked at Deputy Crane. "Virgil, do something." Crane swallowed. He looked at the assembled ranchers, at the Callaway brothers, standing side by side like twin pillars of controlled fury, at the piece of paper in the pastor's hand that represented a power greater than anything Hargrove could offer or threaten. "There's a warrant for you too, Virgil," Wyatt said quietly. "Letters in your own handwriting, confirming you covered up Ethan's murder. The marshal is sending men. They'll be here by tomorrow." The color drained from Crane's face like water running out of a cracked basin. He looked at the ground, his hand dropped from his holster. Without a word, he turned his horse and rode away. Hank Dawson watched his employer. He saw what everyone else saw. A cornered animal, not a leader. The end of something that had felt permanent, but was, like all empires built on fear, as fragile as the lie that held it together. Dawson looked at Wyatt, and between them passed the recognition of 2 men who had once fought on the same side and understood each other in ways that had nothing to do with loyalty to Hargrove. Dawson tipped his hat. Then he rode after Crane. The two hired guns exchanged a look. They were men who calculated odds for a living, and the odds had just shifted dramatically. They followed Dawson without a word. Pemberton, who had been watching from the back with growing alarm, understood that his scheme was collapsing. His legal claim to Eliza had been built on Hargrove's influence and Crane's cooperation. Without them, his fraudulent proxy marriage was nothing but paper and arrogance. "Now wait," Pemberton began. "Leave." Eliza stepped forward. Her voice carried across the silence with a clarity that made Pemberton flinch. "Go back to Philadelphia. Tell your lawyers whatever you want. But know this, I am not your wife. I was never your wife. I was never your property. And if you ever come near me or this family again, you will answer to them." She gestured to the assembled community, 12 families, hard and determined, standing in the Montana sunshine. And to me, Pemberton looked at her, looked at the Calloway brothers, looked at the ranchers with their rifles and their resolve, and he made the calculation that cowards always make. The cost of fighting was greater than the cost of walking away. He turned his horse and rode east without another word, and nobody watched him go because he was not worth watching. Hargrove remained. He sat his horse motionless. The arrogance drained from his face like color from a sunset, and what remained was not defeat. It was rage. Pure, white, hot, impotent rage. "You'll regret this," he said. "No," Wyatt answered. "We won't." Abel Foster moved forward. Then the Turners. Then the Hendersons. One by one, the ranchers of Silver Creek closed ranks, forming a wall of human determination around the Calloway Ranch. They did not threaten. They did not shout. They simply stood. And in their standing was something more powerful than any weapon or any amount of silver. The power of a community that had finally remembered what it meant to stand together. Hargrove looked at them, at these people he had bullied and bought and terrorized for 20 years. And he saw something he had never seen before. Something his money could not buy and his threats could not break. Unity. He wheeled his horse and rode away. He did not look back. The territorial marshal arrived 3 days later with 4 deputies. Hargrove was arrested at his ranch without resistance. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a bitter, corrosive silence. His grand house, built on 20 years of stolen land and broken lives, echoed with emptiness as the marshals walked him out in irons. Virgil Crane turned himself in the following morning. He walked into the marshal's temporary office, set his badge on the desk with the quiet finality of a man who had made peace with his choices and cooperated fully. His testimony was detailed and damning. He described how Hargrove ordered Ethan's horse to be deliberately spooked at the edge of the ravine, how Hank Dawson carried it out while Crane ensured the investigation went nowhere. He spoke without emotion, as though recounting someone else's sins, and the stenographer filled page after page. Hank Dawson disappeared into the Western Territories. Some said Oregon, others said north toward Canada. Abel Foster claimed he saw him riding by moonlight, heading nowhere in particular, which was perhaps the most honest direction a man like Dawson could take. The silver beneath the Calloway Ranch was confirmed by a territorial geologist named Daniel Marsh, a young man from the Colorado School of Mines who spent 3 weeks surveying the property and produced a report that made land speculators and mining companies descend on Silver Creek like locusts. They came with contracts and promises and the particular gleam in their eyes that men get when they smell money in the ground. Wyatt listened to them all. He read every contract. He consulted Eliza, whose mathematical mind proved invaluable for finding the traps hidden in fine print. And then he made a decision that surprised everyone. He did not sell. Instead, he formed a cooperative with the ranchers of Silver Creek, sharing the mineral wealth and among the families who had stood with them on that April morning. The decision was announced at a meeting in the church, the same church where Pastor Pruitt had spent years preaching caution and had finally found courage. Wyatt stood before his neighbors, uncomfortable in the role of public speaker, but unwavering in his conviction. "My father won this land in a card game," he said. "He always said that was proof the Lord has a sense of humor. But he said something else too. He said the land doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land. We're its caretakers, not its owners." He looked out at the faces. Abel Foster, the Turners, the Hendersons, Maggie Whitfield, Ruth McKinnon, all the families who had risked everything. The silver will be mined, the ranch will be funded, but the wealth belongs to this valley, to all of us. Emily Turner wept openly. Abel Foster blew his nose and blamed the spring pollen. Tom Henderson, the most stoic of the Henderson brothers, nodded once with an emotion he made no effort to hide. Jesse stood at the back of the church and watched his brother with an expression that was equal parts admiration and healing. For months he had measured himself against Wyatt and found himself wanting, too reckless, too angry, too broken. But watching Wyatt now, Jesse understood something he had not understood before. Wyatt's strength was not in his size or his silence. It was in his willingness to carry the weight of others. And Jesse, who had spent years running from responsibility, finally saw that carrying weight was not a burden. It was a purpose. After the meeting, Jesse found Wyatt in the churchyard. The afternoon sun was warm, the first truly warm day of the year, and the valley stretched before them in colors so vivid they seemed impossible. "You sounded like Pa up there," Jesse said. Wyatt looked at his brother. "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." Jesse almost then smiled. Then, with the abruptness of a man who has carried something too long and can feel his arms giving out, he spoke. "I'm sorry for everything, for the drinking and the fighting, for being angry at Eliza when she first arrived, and for what I said to Ethan that night." Wyatt put his hand on Jesse's shoulder. The same gesture from weeks ago, but different now, deeper. The weight of it carrying not just comfort, but acceptance and forgiveness in the particular kind of love that exists between brothers who have been through fire together literally and otherwise. "Ethan loved you, Jesse, more than anyone, and he knew you didn't mean what you said." Wyatt paused. "He wrote about you in every letter to Eliza. My brother Jesse, hot-tempered but loyal. He'll need someone to gentle him down. Ethan sent for Eliza not just for himself. He sent for all of us." Jesse nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. But the weight he had carried, the crushing, poisonous weight of guilt and self-blame lifted from his shoulders like smoke rising from a fire that had finally burned out. It did not disappear entirely. Some griefs never do. But it became something he could live with. Something that would become over time not lighter, but more familiar, like a scar that stops hurting but never fades. That evening, for the first time in months, Jesse did not go to the saloon. He sat on the porch with his brother, and Eliza drank coffee instead of whiskey and watched the sunset paint the mountains in colors he had been too drunk or too angry to see for years. The wedding was in May. The wildflowers came all at once as though the valley had been saving its color for precisely this moment. Columbine in purple and white, larkspur in blue, Indian paintbrush in blazing orange red. The meadows became tapestries. The mountainsides glowed. Pastor Pruitt performed the ceremony outdoors beside the fence line of the Callaway Ranch with the mountains standing witness and the creek providing music. Eliza wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself from fabric Maggie Whitfield had given her as a wedding gift. Her honey blonde hair was down, falling in loose waves past her shoulders, the way Wyatt had never seen it, the way she had never worn it, because letting your hair down in front of someone required a kind of trust she had never given anyone before. The cameo brooch, her mother's brooch, sat at her throat, catching the May sunlight. Wyatt wore a clean white shirt. It was the cleanest shirt anyone in Silver Creek had ever seen on him. He had shaved for the first time in weeks, and his jaw, strong and square, was smoother than Eliza had ever seen it. He had removed his hat, which she realized was also a first, and his dark blonde hair, sun-streaked, and thick, caught the light in a way that made him look almost young. Almost like the man he might have been if life had been kinder. Jesse stood beside his brother as best man. His golden eyes were wet, but he was smiling. A real smile. The first one in more than a year. The vows were simple. Wyatt was not a man of many words, and the words he chose were all the more powerful for their scarcity. "I'm not good at talking," he said. "Never have been, but I keep my word. And my word is this. Every day I have left, I'll be right here. With you." Eliza smiled. The smile that had made him laugh for the first time in 3 years, the smile that had cracked granite and melted winter and turned a house back into a home. "I came here looking for shelter," she said. "I found home." Pastor Pruitt pronounced them married, and Jesse whistled so loudly it startled every horse within half a mile, and Abel Foster wiped his eyes and said something about pollen that nobody believed. And the people of Silver Creek gathered in the spring sunshine on land they had fought to protect. cheered for a love that had been earned through fire and snow, and stubbornness and the quiet, relentless courage of two people who had refused to let the world break them. That first spring together, Eliza planted apple trees along the fence line. Saplings ordered from a nursery in Helena, shipped by train, and nurtured through the last cold nights of the season. She dug the holes herself, kneeling in the dark Montana soil with her dress muddy and her hair escaping its pins, and Wyatt knelt beside her, and together, his massive hands and her delicate ones, they set each sapling into the ground. "What are those?" he asked, though he could see perfectly well. "Apple trees. Someday this ranch will have an orchard." "Planning on staying that long?" She looked at him, at the mountains, at the house with its blue kitchen curtains, in the new barn, and the cattle grazing in the green pasture. "This place is my home," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Their first child was born the following winter. A boy, born in a warm room with a doctor from Helena present, because Wyatt had sworn an oath to himself that would never be broken. They named him Emmett after his grandfather. Wyatt held his son for the first time with hands that had split wood and fought fires and built fences and broken horses, hands that could bend iron and gentle a wild stallion, and those hands trembled like leaves in an autumn wind. His face carried an expression Eliza had never seen: tender fear, stunned wonder, and love so pure it was almost visible, a light behind his amber eyes that had not been there before and would never go out. Jesse carved a wooden horse for the baby. It was rough and lopsided, and clearly the work of a man who was better with real horses than wooden ones. But it was made in 3 sleepless nights by calloused hands that held it as carefully as if it were made of gold, and it was the first gift his nephew ever received. The ranch thrived, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the steady, relentless growth of something built on solid ground. Jesse stopped drinking entirely and discovered an unexpected gift for training horses. His patience with animals, the gentleness he hid from people, made him the best horse trainer in the valley. Ranchers from neighboring counties brought their young stock to Jesse Calloway, and the wild-eyed colts he received became the steady, willing partners. He returned transformed by a man who had learned that the gentleness he gave to horses was the same gentleness he needed to give himself. Eliza opened a school, twice a week in the Calloway living room, with a blackboard made from a painted door and chalk from limestone at the creek. 12 children sat on benches and learned their letters from a woman who had learned hers from a school teacher, father in Philadelphia. And on Tuesday evenings, after the children were in bed, the adults came. Jesse first openly, now without pretending. Then Abel Foster, grumbling about his old eyes. Then Sam Turner, then Tom Henderson, then half a dozen others. Men with calloused hands and weathered faces, holding pencils like foreign objects, learning to write their names with the focused determination of people who understood that knowledge was a different kind of wealth, the kind that could not be stolen or burned or taken by winter. A proper schoolhouse was built the following year, funded by the Silver Cooperative. A small wooden building with a bell on the roof, named for the man whose discovery had made it possible: the Ethan Calloway School. Jesse stood at the dedication with his jaw tight and his golden eyes bright, and when he spoke, he said only this: "My brother believed in this valley. He was right. A daughter came 2 years after Emmett. They named her Sarah." When Eliza suggested the name, Wyatt went still. His jaw worked. The muscles in his face shifted in ways she had learned to read, like weather, the subtle signs of an internal storm. He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. Once. Certain. And in that single nod was the entirety of his healing. Sarah was not being replaced. Sarah was being remembered. The new Sarah would carry the old Sarah's name, the way the creek carried snowmelt forward into the future, proof that what had been lost could still matter. A third child came a year later, another boy. They named him Ethan. Jesse held his namesake nephew in his scarred, gentle hands and whispered into the baby's ear, "I'm going to tell you about your uncle. Every day. You'll know he was the best of us. And you'll know he's the one who brought your mama here." The years passed the way years pass in good places. Not without hardship, not without loss. A hard winter took 6 calves and nearly took Abel Foster, who survived out of pure stubbornness, and Ruth McKinnon's refusal to let him die. A drought turned the summer brown, and the future is uncertain, but the spring that never froze kept the Calloway land green, while the rest of the valley prayed for rain. Jesse married a schoolteacher from Billings, a quiet woman with steady eyes, who saw through his bluster to the tender man beneath and loved both versions equally. They built a cabin 100 yards from the main house, close enough to help and far enough for peace. The Silver Cooperative brought modest prosperity to Silver Creek, not the kind of wealth that corrupts, the kind that heals, enough so that no family in the valley had to choose between food and medicine, enough to build the schoolhouse and repair the church and lay a proper road down Main Street so it no longer turned to mud every spring, enough to transform a collection of isolated, frightened homesteads into a community bound not by silver, but by the memory of a morning when they had stood together and discovered that they were stronger than the man who had kept them afraid. 33 years is a long time, long enough for saplings to become trees, long enough for babies to become men and women, long enough for the sharp edges of grief to wear smooth, not gone, but gentled like river stones polished by decades of flowing water. It was 1920 when the story found its ending, or rather, when the ending found the story. Wyatt Calloway was 67 years old. He moved more slowly now. His knees protested the stairs. His back ached on cold mornings, which in Montana meant most mornings. His dark blonde hair had gone silver, and the stubble on his jaw was white. But he still rose before dawn. Still drank his first coffee on the porch, looking out at the mountains the way a man looks at an old friend. Still carried himself with the quiet authority of a man whose word was his bond and whose bond had never been broken. Eliza was 56. Her honey blonde hair had gone to silver too, still pinned in the same modest updo with soft tendrils escaping around her temples, the same way it had looked the night she stepped off the train into nothing. Her cornflower blue eyes were still bright, still curious, still looking at the world with that particular combination of tenderness and steel that had made Wyatt Calloway fall in love with a woman he was afraid to love. The lines around her eyes were laugh lines. This was a face that had done more smiling than crying, more hoping than fearing, more living than surviving. The cameo brooch sat at her throat, worn smooth by more than 3 decades of wear. The ranch had become something else, something larger than a ranch, a homestead, a legacy. The valley spread before them, green and gold, the Calloway land stretching to the mountains in every direction. The apple trees Eliza had planted that first spring were a full orchard, now hundreds of trees, their canopy casting shade over the fence line, where she had knelt in the mud more than 30 years ago, and imagined a future that seemed impossible. Emmett, their firstborn, ran the ranch now. He had his father's build and his mother's mind, a combination that made him formidable. Sarah was the school teacher in town working in the building that bore her uncle's name. And Jesse, 59, silver-haired, still riding every day, lived in the cabin next door with his wife and their 4 children and their 6 grandchildren. And on Sunday evenings, the entire Calloway clan gathered at the big house for dinner, and the noise and the laughter and the arguments and the love filled the rooms that had once been silent with grief. On a warm evening in late May, the kind of evening that justified every frozen morning and every hard winter and every moment of doubt, Wyatt and Eliza sat on the porch. The porch was wide, planked with wood. Wyatt had cut and shaped himself more than 30 years ago. 2 rocking chairs sat side by side, also handmade, built during the months when Eliza was pregnant with Emmett, when Wyatt had needed something to do with his hands, because the waiting was driving him mad. The wood was worn smooth by 3 decades of sitting. Every scratch and groove was a year. Every faded mark was a season. The chairs were a history written in oak. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and deepening purple. It was the same sunset they had watched from this porch 1,000 times, and it was entirely new the way every sunset is, because the light is never the same, and the people watching it are never the same, even when they think they are. Grandchildren chased each other through the orchard, their laughter carrying across the valley like birdsong. The creek ran clear and bright in the distance. The cattle grazed in pastures that were green and lush. The air smelled of grass and pine and wildflowers and the faint sweetness of apple blossoms. Wyatt reached across the space between the chairs. Eliza placed her hand in his, her small hand lined now with years, but still delicate, still graceful, disappeared into his massive palm the way it had on a frozen train platform in the winter of 1887. His hand was older now, scarred and weathered, and spotted with age, but it was the same hand. The hand that had pulled her from the snow. The hand that had built fences and fought fires and held newborn children and wiped away tears and never, not once, in 33 years, let go of hers when she needed it. You know, he said. His voice was deeper now, rougher, slower. But it still carried the weight of a man who did not waste words. When I found you at that station, I only meant to help you survive one night. And instead, she asked. Her eyes, those cornflower blue brown eyes, were bright with something that was not tears, but was close enough to be their kin. He looked at her, at the orchard she had planted, at the house she had filled, at the grandchildren running through wildflowers she had taught them the names of, at the life, the enormous, sprawling, messy, beautiful life they had built together from nothing, from snow and ashes and stubbornness and the radical, unreasonable, unbreakable belief that tomorrow could be better than today. Instead, Wyatt Calloway said, "You gave me a life." She squeezed his hand, he squeezed back. And they sat together in the fading light, two people who had found each other in a blizzard and built a world from the wreckage of the one that had tried to destroy them, rocking gently in chairs worn smooth by 33 years of exactly this, sitting together, watching the light, holding on. Inside the house, someone was playing a harmonica. Jesse, badly as always, but with an enthusiasm that had not diminished in 3 decades. The melody drifted through the open windows and mixed with the evening sounds, the laughter and the bird song, and the distant murmur of the creek that had never frozen and never would. She still remembered stepping off that train into nothing. No husband waiting, no house in sight, just snow and wind and 1,500 miles of loneliness behind her. A letter that had promised a home, a letter that had lied. But life, real life, was never what you planned. It was what you built from the ruins of the plans that failed. 33 years later, sitting on the porch he had built with his own hands, watching their grandchildren chase each other through the orchard she had planted with hers, Eliza Calloway, who had once been Eliza Harper, who had once been a freezing girl on a train platform, with nothing but a trunk and 7 letters and a cameo brooch, thought the one thought that mattered. That was the day my life began, the day the lonely cowboy rode through the blizzard, the day he offered his hand, the day she placed her frozen fingers in his calloused palm and felt beneath the cold and the grief and the fear the first faint stirring of something that would grow over 33 years of labor and laughter and loss and love into everything. Winter always ends, but love the kind built by calloused hands and steady hearts, by people who earn it through fire and snow, and the refusal to surrender that love endures. It endures forever.